Hello and welcome to ChooseFI. Today on the show, we have our good friend Jessica from the Fioneers. And this one is going to be a really interesting episode because I think it's something that impacts nearly all of us on the FI journey. Jessica came to me and said, "Hey, Brad, I just recently did a presentation on the cure for the boring middle. And I think this would make for a really impactful ChooseFI episode." And I was instantly taken by it because this is something I hear from you, our community, all the time about, hey, the beginning of my fight journey, it was so exciting. It was fun. We had to do all this action and everything now is set. And now I'm just waiting and it feels never ending. And we in the fight community now have termed that the boring middle. But it doesn't have to be this waiting game. In fact, this is arguably the most important part of your whole fight journey because this is where you design the life you want to live. And I think that's what Jessica is uniquely suited to bring to the show today. This is going to be a lot of fun. With that, welcome to ChooseFI. Jessica, I am so happy to have you here. This should be a lot of fun. This is your third time on the show, but it's been over a year and a half, which is hard to believe.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, this should be cool. So, okay, the boring middle. First, how do you define that?
So I think I define it very similar to how you did at the beginning, where the beginning of people's FI journey has a lot of energy and excitement, right? We're getting the finances in place. We're learning about the mechanics. We're figuring out how to increase our income, decrease our expenses, like figure out what we don't value and stop spending on those things, right? Everything is action packed for a period of time. And then we figure out this investment thing, we automate it. Like everything just sort of gets to a place where you're like, okay, I'm at a steady state. And then so many people, and I've seen so many people in the ChooseFI community and just the FI community generally say, okay, so what now? I feel like I'm in the boring middle, the doldrums of FI. I'm just now in a waiting game. And I think that couldn't be further from the truth. And part of it, I think, for me, is that I just know I'm an impatient person. Like, I don't wait well. And so, right, when I'm like, it's a waiting game, like, it does not have to be a waiting game. This is the most exciting part of the FI journey because you no longer have to think about the finances. You get to start thinking about life and what you want life to look like. And that's the whole point of FI in the first place.
Yes, that is exactly. Oh my God, that is exactly it. You're speaking to my soul for sure, and you know that obviously. Like, and I wonder if we all don't focus enough on this. Hey, this is about your life, as opposed to it's just the nuts and bolts of money. I mean, I feel like in my heart of hearts that I always say the nuts and bolts of money is maybe 5% of your journey. Once you have that on autopilot, it's simple, and you essentially never think about it again. Right? Obviously, with the caveat that hey, every year you should review your insurance and you should check for lifestyle creep and you should negotiate your salary, right? We're not saying that you're not doing that stuff, clearly. But once you have that said, Jessica, it truly is about living a better life. And like that's the real secret sauce of financial independence is once you aren't stressed about your finances, you can put that aside and think about what actually matters in the 8 or 9 decades you get on this planet, right? I mean, that's what this is all about.
Exactly. And I think sometimes like the finance part is easier. So we stay there because it's like cut and dry. There's a formula, right? There's a very specific, like personal finance is personal, but 95% of the things apply to everyone. And, we sort of go within that stream, I guess. But figuring out what you really want in life, that's the hard part. And I think one thing that I've really tried to do and figure out for myself and share for other people is there's a formula for that too. And I think that's the hard part because people don't know how to do it.
Yeah. Oh man, that is super interesting. Because in fairness, and I think you and I talked about this before we hit record, this is an iterative process. And it's not just for the boring middle, right? This is also very applicable for people who have reached FI. Because I got to be honest, I don't feel like I have it figured out all the time, or really most of the time, right? So when I hear you say there's a formula for that too, my spidey sense goes up because I want to dive into that, right? And like, and what we did talk about before we hit record was maybe we make this episode a little bit of, okay, you talk about the cure for the boring middle, lifestyle design, design a life I don't want to retire from, and that there's a process to this. There's stages, and it is iterative. Maybe I play along and do this for me, and maybe that'll give some inspiration to somebody else out there. So I'm definitely up for that, but I don't want to steal your thunder, obviously. So, formula for that too. How on earth is there a formula for living a better life?
Yeah. So, I like to think about this as a lifestyle design process. And the biggest learnings that I've had are from design thinking. And so, how are people, right? Engineers, architects, and people like this actually designing products and bridges and, all of those sorts of things. And we can apply that exact same framework to our own lifestyle and designing what that looks like. And so, when I think of lifestyle design, I think of design generally, right? In the design process, you're seeking to understand what is needed, right? And what people actually want. And then you're challenging assumptions about how things have been done before, right? And saying, are there new possibilities? You're saying, here's what success would look like for this thing. And then you're brainstorming a whole variety of different kinds of options, some things that may have never been seen before. And then you're creating some prototypes and you're experimenting and getting feedback and adjusting that thing all along the way. Right. And so that's this process. And then you learn from that experimentation to define this is the thing that's needed. Right. So applying that to lifestyle design, then I think of lifestyle design as like three distinct stages. So your first stage, and I'll preface this by saying I think it's a cycle too. So like
Mm.
you start with stage one, but then once you get through stage three, you're actually sort of restarting the process over and over again. And this snowball continues to roll.
Okay, so that's kind of like the experiments and the feedback. It's this iterative. So for everybody out there, picture this circle of these different
Yes.
stages because it does kind of loop back as you get more information, as you figure out a little more about what does this lifestyle that I want look like. And sometimes you think there are some things and you realize, maybe that actually isn't part of my ideal life. And that's okay. You've learned something.
Exactly. Yes. So there's that experimentation process that needs to happen. So, stage one, I think of as like this is where you're identifying the elements of your ideal life. So, if you're thinking about a design thinking process, right, this is where you're seeking to understand, you're challenging assumptions, you're crafting this definition of success. If we apply that to our lifestyle, right, we're seeking to understand who we are, what we value, and what we really want. And then we're challenging those assumptions of what everyone in our lives and society has told us what we should do and who we should be. And we want to start expanding, like, what do I actually think is possible for me? In this process, I think part of it also importantly is beginning to craft our own definition of what does success actually mean in my life. And so those are sort of the high level. When I'm working with clients and sort of doing this for myself, when I'm going through stage one, I have this framework that's like your what, your why, and your how. And I think of your what as here's the things that you absolutely love to do that give you energized, you're totally engaged, you get into flow doing them. You have your why, so your core motivations. Here's the things that really inspire me and motivate me and sort of get me up in the morning. This is the reason why I do what I do. And then the how, I think, is sometimes the hardest part to figure out. It's what are the conditions that I need in my life to thrive? So, how do I carry out my what and my why in a way that actually feels really good and life giving?
That is interesting. So that last one, the what are the conditions I need in my life to thrive? That one jumps out to me. So it's funny. I have long mentioned that I love the show Survivor on CBS. So my family, we all sit down essentially every Wednesday night and watch that show. And my kids are always saying to me, like, Dad, you would win this show, like socially, strategically, like whatever. But you'd be the first person voted out because you wouldn't be able to sleep and you wouldn't eat and you'd be miserable and everybody would hate you. So that's a very kind of ridiculous, self-deprecating way of saying like, I feel like I've set my life up in this like very narrow band of like, okay, I thrive under these circumstances. But if anything else goes awry, like I don't sleep well or whatever, like I'm a disaster of a person. And like I've always taken that as like a crutch. But it's interesting in hearing you say, and obviously you're probably not picturing someone quite as extreme as me here, but like, what are the conditions I need in my life to thrive? I think that can be a very positive thing when done constructively, right? And okay, hey, maybe I do feel better when I get 8 hours of sleep a night. Maybe I do feel better when I take a walk or I see friends or I laugh or I experience joy. Like, look for those energy giving parts of your life and build those in and just say, okay, this is part of my thriving life. And so, anyway, that was a very long way of saying, like, I see you nodding and smiling along. So I think I'm onto something, but I'd love to hear your response to that.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly right. It's figuring out how do we work with our nature to make life actually work. And I don't actually think you're an extreme example,
Nice.
right? Like, I think that for the vast majority of people in the world, full time work doesn't work for people. And like the level of stress and just context switching, so much of that just really, really doesn't work for people. But we feel like we need to do what is expected of us, right? And then we feel bad about it. Like we are like, oh, well, I should just be able to push through and do this stuff like everyone else, instead of saying, you know, I actually am going to be my best if I get 8 hours of sleep every night and I really prioritize that. And like, I'm an introvert and I like to go deep with a small number of people and have really deep, close relationships. That gives me energy. I don't want to have a million friends that, I have to keep up with and like do all of the,
Yeah.
paying attention to like what aligns with your nature, I think is really important. And, for me, I can share one example. So I know we've talked about this in previous episodes, but I actually have some pretty severe anxiety. It's better than it used to be, but that's a really important thing to take into account, right? As I'm designing the life that I want. I don't need to say, well, you should just figure out how to deal with this stuff, right? Instead, I can say, what do I actually need? How do I need to take care of myself so that it doesn't hold me back from doing the things that I really want to do in my life?
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. And right, like find what works for you, your nature, your energy levels. I think we all need to be more cognizant of that because, right, we try to fit ourselves into these narrow little boxes, right? Like you've used the word should a number of times. And I actually heard something really interesting. I think it was a buddy of mine who was talking about this in a mastermind group that I'm a part of, but I hope I'm not misattributing it to like a podcast or something. But they were describing, like, hey, when you're faced with what do I want to do? Or like two different options. He actually said he looks at which one feels more compelling, like I should do that. And he purposely does the opposite one because he's lived this whole life of doing what I should do and putting my wants and whatever my desires are to the side because I should. And I know this is kind of a silly little example, but like if you have a 50-50 decision, his argument was find whichever one you feel like you should do and do the exact opposite one. And again, silly little anecdote, but I thought that was cool. And what it really speaks to is so many of us live our lives based on what we think we should do. And goodness, Jessica, life is so short, right? Like it is so short. And to just constantly be doing things for other people or because you think somebody else cares or is going to notice or people are going to think better of you. Like, come on. You just, at some point, you have to do things for yourself.
So, in my like group coaching programs and retreats that I run, one of the things that we joke about is that we have a should jar, like a swear jar kind of. So if anyone ever says should, we want to catch it and then encourage each other to reframe it. So like, okay, you just said you should do something. What do you actually want in that situation? And is the thing that you're saying should, is that something that you want or is that something that you feel obligated to do? And for what reason? And so there's always these conversations about reframing. And I would encourage everyone to start listening to where shoulds are showing up.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Okay, so we're on the first stage of this process, right?
The
So
first stage. So I actually want to turn it to you, Brad.
okay.
So let's talk about the what, the why, and the how. So for you, when you're thinking about this, like what are the things that you absolutely love to do that like get you into flow?
I think where I've experienced flow the most in my life is actually with like athletic pursuits. And maybe this speaks to the fact that I don't feel like I have a lot of flow in my current life. And maybe we could dive into that. But yeah, basically playing soccer growing up or even as an adult, like I can picture like flow states where, yeah, time just seems to bend in weird ways. And I'm just out there having fun, playing this game that I love. And yeah, it just feels like time distorts in a very interesting way and it just feels energizing. I actually recently got it where I was a coach actually of my daughter's volleyball team. And Jessica, it's so interesting. Like if I would say like what was the most fun thing I did in all of 2023, it would actually be coaching this volleyball team. And I never played volleyball. I mean, I played recreationally. So like, I'm a reasonably good athlete, so I can pick sports up, but like I had so much fun teaching these kids, like to the point where my wife joked, like, my daughter's not playing anymore. She's like, you should still volunteer to be coach. You love that. It was so much fun. And I mean, I do. I miss it. I really, really miss it. And I guess the only other place where I probably experience flow is in maybe these podcast recordings too, in the sense that like I've described it as like there's something about and believe me, I'm not arguing I'm like the greatest podcaster in the world or anything like that. It's putting the ego aside. It's just like there's something that just works for me when it comes to these podcasts that like it brings out the absolute best in me that sometimes I don't even know I have inside of me. So like there's just something about the medium that I just love and connecting with people and just getting to ask these questions that I don't generally like. I don't know. I don't talk to that many people in my real life. So it's like it's just really cool to connect.
So, okay, so I want to go back to the coaching example. What about coaching did you love?
Yeah, it's interesting, and it might be hard to put into words, but I'm going to try since obviously this is a podcast. So for me, I feel like I have an understanding of how to teach things that reaches its intended audience, and I also think again just from playing sports my whole life that like I have an understanding of like how kids improve at things, and it was almost like this fun experiment where I got to like instead of standing on the sidelines and watching somebody else coach, which is what I've always done, I jumped in and I did it. And man, these kids thrived. It was so much fun. I mean, the kids had a ball. They improved so dramatically. Like, I would have people coming up to me afterwards, like, this looks like you're running like a volleyball clinic. And I was like, I've never even played volleyball. Like, it was just like, it was this cool experiment for how do you get kids to enjoy something and improve. And it just worked. And it was awesome. I mean, I was running around the whole time. Like most of the coaches were, it just was very slow paced. I made it this fun, exciting thing where the kids were just hitting the ball hundreds of times in like a 45-minute practice as opposed to like just a few times. Because I think repetition is so important for learning. So okay, I'll stop because I feel like this is a tangent. But yeah, it was like the most fun thing I've done. I loved it.
Awesome. Okay. So it's interesting from those examples, I'm hearing a few things, and I'm also interested to jump into the other things, but I'm hearing like teaching, coaching, problem solving. So it's like a puzzle almost. It's like, how do I get people from here to there and help them through this like transformation process? Right. And that
Yeah.
could apply to the podcasting too, that it's like, I would like to see people get from here to here. Right. And that the way that you can do that is through like problem solving. And one thing that I wrote down as you were talking about potentially a core motivation for you, part of your why would be curiosity
Interesting.
because of like this desire to ask questions and to learn through inquiry.
Yes, that's interesting. I probably would not have conceptualized it that way, but I think there is some aspect of that for sure. And yeah, I wonder, like, I'm again thinking of motivation and how it maybe ties to Phi and what I do here at the podcast is on some level. And we've always described Phi as like a superpower, right? Like on some level, it feels like I have this like insider knowledge on like how to live. I know that sounds like grandiose and I hope it doesn't come across like terribly, but like I feel like I have the secrets sometimes and I want to scream it from the rooftops, but to do it again then in a way that people are receptive to. And I think obviously kids learning volleyball, is a very different message than getting people to save more money and live a better life. But I think there's some tie there.
I agree. I definitely think that there's some tie there. Okay, so then another example that I want to talk about is so you said, and sometimes we can like get insights from other people as well. And so I think you said you were talking about Survivor and your daughter
Yes.
telling you that you would be so incredibly good on that show. So can you tell me a little bit about why?
Yeah. um, it's funny. I don't talk about myself all that much even on my own podcast, so it feels a little weird. But I'll certainly play along because I think it's important. I think my girls think higher of myself than I do, maybe. Which is actually really cool to like see it from somebody else's eyes. Like they think I'd succeed at all three aspects of Survivor. So like athletically and physically for sure, but socially and strategically. They always tell me like, oh, dad, you'd be the absolute best at this. You'd have all these alliances, you'd be working all the different sides and people would believe you. People trust you. Like and obviously this is a game about deception, right? So, I understand the kind of irony about this, but just the fact that I guess people connect to me on some level. And I think I would because of all the games I've played my whole life, board games, strategy games, etc. Like I think I'd be really good at it. And yeah, it's cool to see them. Like I think that in my head, but then to hear them say it just apropos of nothing is pretty amazing.
Yeah. Okay. So I feel like there's three things that I'm pulling from that. So one is, and this is sort of from what you were talking about with the sports and the soccer too, is like doing something physical that's like hands on and sort of pushing yourself seems to be something that's part of that sort of flow
Yes.
state for you. This connection, which I see ties to in the podcasting and all of that, is like this connection with other people and this building of trust as well. And then I actually was curious about the board game thing because
Mm,
I do feel like that also connects to like the strategy and the problem solving and the puzzles. Like, let me put all of these pieces together and figure out how to move forward. Right. And so, yeah, we don't need to dive into this so much more, but like from this short conversation, I feel like there's some key things that as we move through this process, like you could be thinking more about how could you bring all of the things together? So the physical activity, the curiosity and connection. So curiosity through inquiry, the problem solving and puzzles, right? Using all of that. And maybe this is part of your why, the core motivation is like, how do you help use the puzzles and the connection and the trust and the everything to bring people through a process to help teach them something that that you feel like is important to share with the world.
yeah, that certainly makes sense. I'd be curious your thoughts on like, and again, we're just talking about me here, but clearly the larger conversation and how to think through the conversation is why we're doing this, right? So that's the important thing. But on some level, even though I'm making a much larger difference in the world, let's say, with the podcast, the volleyball coaching just felt so much more viscerally fun. Like I was seeing these kids transform in front of me, both their actual volleyball skills, which frankly don't really matter all that much. This was a YMCA volleyball league, but also like them changing as like confident individuals. Like I literally saw some of these kids totally come out of their shells and like it was just so cool. And like if you ask me, obviously on a like a absolute level, which matters more, the podcast does. But like, man, that volleyball coaching, I mean, I gotta be honest, that was way more fun.
So that's really interesting because I feel like that helps to inform your how. So, what are the ways that you want to carry out the what and the why, the teaching, the coaching, doing it in an inquiry based way, whatever it is? Like, there's something about being able to see the immediate impact, which is, we can't always see that. But there could be a way to say, are there ways for you to be able to do things in different sectors of your life where you can see the more immediate impact on people. So I'll give an example. So, we run a YouTube channel and a blog and all of those things. But for me, the things that I really enjoy most is when I get to like go deep with people in one-on-one or in small groups. And that's the most exciting thing for me because I get to see the immediate feedback, shifts, changes, like what's resonating with them, what they can take away, what actions they're going to take as a result of what we're doing together. And so for me, sometimes content creation, so for example, I have like a self-paced online course that I'm like, like I want to just be hearing from people more
Yeah.
often, And so for me, that's why I love the in-person retreats and the small group coaching and that kind of thing. That's what I feel like gives me the most energy is when I get to work with people through a process and ask them questions and all of that. So I do wonder if there's a piece of that for you too.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, okay, so with you then, does that change how you go about creating content or your business or however you conceptualize it? Like, okay, that self-paced course, that doesn't feel like an immediate positive to you. I mean, obviously you created it, it's helping people, but if you're not getting the feedback from them, like, do you add in some other aspect of feedback or do you maybe frankly stop doing that in favor of more in-person events? Like, is that something you've been thinking about?
Yeah, exactly. So I recently decided like I still have that course available to people, but I don't really promote it. And I'm thinking about like, what's a way that I can actually run it live, which I know goes against like all this online business thing that people say, like make things that are passive.
Passive
But
income.
like
Oh, give me a break.
I don't want it to be passive. Like I actually enjoy the interaction and the engagement with people. And then another thing, so for the YouTube channel, one of the things that I focus on is doing a lot of YouTube lives.
Oh,
And so I'm actually like able to engage with people directly on those live conversations and they'll ask questions, I'll ask them questions for response. And so that fits with me a lot better than, this sort of passive, I'm going to put something out there and
right.
see if people download it or watch it or read it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because, right, like from your perspective, if you had even 20 people live giving you comments, that has to feel a whole lot different than, oh, this video got 50,000 views. Because that
Yeah.
it's just abstract as opposed to, wow, these are real human beings sitting here in real time with me going through this. And it's not to say one is better than the other or all YouTubers should
Yeah.
only be doing lives. We're not saying that. But like, you've realized that that's way more important for you. And that's, yeah, this is cool. So, okay, a lot of this process, this first stage, which I suspect is just such a critical part, is find where the energy is, right? Like you're asking yourselves these questions, but at the essence, it's what am I getting energy from? Or what am I just putting time and energy into that feels like a suck, right? That like just feels like a net negative.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, okay. So that's stage one.
Okay. Wow.
Stage one, I would say, is the part where if you're going through it, like the first time through a lifestyle design process, that is where you're going to spend most of your time is figuring out like, who am I and what do I like and what is my nature? So once you have an understanding of what some of these things are, there's two paths to start focusing on. One of them is how can I start to implement and shift and do some of these things immediately? And sometimes I think of the short term changes as how can I make this one area of my life 20 to 30% better immediately? Are there things that I can incorporate into my days and my weeks and my months that would enable me to do this? I think the important thing about doing that is one, it immediately makes life better, right? And it provides you with more brain space to be able to go through the rest of that process and to dream big and do some of that experimentation. So, before we jump into the second thing that you can do, which is dive into the long term changes,
Yeah.
Brad, I'm curious if there's anything in your mind that you're like, what might I do differently in my day or my week or my month to incorporate some of these things more regularly?
Yeah. Okay. So I love where we've gone with this. And yeah, then it's like I understand these things that give me more energy now. But I know you've talked about like, okay, maybe look like what does an ideal day look like to you, or a week or a month or something like that. But even down to the micro of a day. And this is where I sometimes get caught up, even with myself. Like yesterday, when I got home, my wife asked, like, oh, how'd your day go? Blah, blah, blah. And I was like, I felt unsatisfied with it, even though, like, in a fairly short period of time, I recorded an amazing podcast and I had just a ridiculously good workout. I studied Japanese on a walk. Like, I did these three things. But in my mind, this day felt unsatisfying. And I think it's because I have unrealistic expectations of like what a day is. And I don't know how this ties into this or if it does necessarily, but like even when I've built some of these things in that like I think are super important, I suspect it's like that should comes into it of like, oh, but I should have done these four things on my to-do list that didn't get accomplished. Like, how would you help counsel somebody like me in that scenario where like objectively that was an amazing day? Like it really was. But yet I felt unsatisfied probably because of the shoulds.
So I actually wonder if it's the shoulds. Like, I do think that there's something about like when we're designing a life that we love, right? We have to focus on the short term and also the long term. And, I'm thinking of like Doc G and his taking stock message and how the people who are most satisfied in life have a climb that they're working toward.
Yeah.
Right. And so I think there's a combination. And actually, in my coaching programs, we do a few different activities. One's focused on this ideal day, and another is focused on what are these peak experiences that we've had throughout our lives. And that, right, like lifestyle design is both of those things. And so I'm curious if it's the shoulds or if it's that you're doing all of these awesome things on a day to day basis, but do you have a vision of like, what am I moving toward and how am I moving toward my purpose?
Yeah, I probably don't. I could contrive and after the fact, like, whatever post hoc reasoning or whatever it's called, of, oh, I plan to go to Japan. And that's why, I've always wanted to climb Mount Fuji and that's why I'm learning Japanese. But like, if I really thought it was imminent immediately, I would be studying harder. I would be doing, like, again, that would be a rationalization for why I'm doing it. The same with the exercise of like, oh, I want to get in X shape or I want to live longer, be healthier. Like, but yeah, it doesn't feel concrete to your point. Like it feels like I'm just kind of going through the motions on some level, even though again, like I'm doing these things that are fun and useful and like I'm seeing great results in all these different things. But you're right. Like it doesn't feel like there's any climb. I mean, even with the podcast, frankly, right? It's like, obviously we've been so fortunate and, on many levels and lightning in a bottle and all that stuff of like being very successful with the podcast, but yet it doesn't feel like there's another level or anything I'm shooting for. I'm just showing up week in, week out and recording another podcast episode. So yeah, your point is very well taken on all of those counts.
Yeah. And I've been thinking a lot about the way that Doc G thinks about purpose. And I actually had him on one of my YouTube lives recently. And, he's writing his new book about purpose specifically. And like, it doesn't have to be like, I'm going to be the biggest podcast in the world or I'm going to create a cure for cancer. Sometimes it's more about like, who do I want to be? And how am I like living into that? For me, it's interesting. I have this legacy statement that I feel like is the guiding force for my life. And it's that I abso-freaking-lutely love my life and like inspire others to believe that they can also do the same.
Wow.
And that I take action, like through my words and my actions, I help create a world where more people have the opportunity to thrive. And it's like every single day, any action that I do can support that legacy
Right.
statement. And like that is the thing that I want to be known for. Right. And so for me, I feel like that's the sort of purpose statement
Okay.
that, not every day is perfect. And not every day do I feel like everything is, working toward that. But yeah, I think there's something about thinking through and figuring out what is this bigger, meaningful thing that you're choosing to work toward, whether it's, I want to abso-freaking-lutely love my life.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. I as you can tell, I'm at a kind of a loss for words. I think a lot of us struggle with this, right? Is like, does it have to be more, more, more? Or like you were saying, like having that goal or something to shoot for, something to climb towards? Or like is satisfaction and just enough? Like, is there some place for that, some significant place for that in a life well lived? And I think there very clearly is, but there's this constant antagonism between the two, I think, on some level. And I mean, I feel this. I mean, to be perfectly honest, like even though I think by any measure, my life has been more impactful on other people than I could have ever dreamed. Like it would have been laughable to suggest that I could have this kind of impact on the world 10 years ago. Like absolutely laughable. Jessica, I'm not going to lie. Like every week, I feel like I'm not doing enough. And I don't know where that comes from. I think it's because like I feel like there's so much more that I could be doing or could have done to like help people that are new to financial independence, that it never feels like I've done enough, even though obviously by any objective measure I've done a lot, you know? So it's like it's this weird constant tension.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Yeah, I think there's something around figuring out the right balance of satisfaction and growth. Like being happy with where and being satisfied with where we are at this moment and knowing that we're always going to want more. That's always going to be the case. I think, as I'm listening to you, I do feel like one thing that might be helpful is to pay attention to the shoulds. Like, are you feeling like you should be doing more things that are impacting other people? And, actually, I think that's like a pretty common barrier for people as they're working through, like, do I even deserve to have this life that I really love if there's so much more and so many more challenges in the world and feel like I should be spending my time solving these challenges? So there's this balance to strike between how are we satisfied with the life that we are living today and also wanting some sort of climb or dream that we're working toward. Because I think a lot of satisfaction actually comes from being on a journey toward something. And this is, something that people have found in studies, right? That the satisfaction comes from the act of working toward something. So I think this brings us into this like stage 2, right? Which is to dream big about what you really want. And so you've figured out some of the things that you really love. You have figured out, are there ways that I can do those things more often in my days? And then I personally love to do the dream big stage with a group of people. So you can start with brainstorming, like, hey, what are all the ways that I could bring together teaching and curiosity and inquiry based learning and physical activity and problem solving together? You're going to come up with like 5 ideas. But if you have a group of like 4 to 5 other people, they're going to come up with a million other ideas of things that you probably would never even consider. And so that's why I feel like community along this process is so incredibly valuable because like we don't see that far for ourselves. We need other people who are like you, like your kids almost. That's like you are so capable of doing this big crazy thing and that people are like, yeah, you can do that. Something like switches in our brain that's like, maybe that would be possible.
Yeah.
Right. So I feel like that's what we do during this dream big stage is, brainstorm with other people and hear what are the crazy pie in the sky ideas of things that could bring all of these things together. And it doesn't necessarily have to be work stuff too, right? It could be passion projects or something that you want to do for fun, right? I think sometimes we think too small about this and we think it has to be something that's conventionally considered work or productive. Yeah. So that's the dreaming big stage. And then from there, Then we move into the experimentation. So for the dreaming big stage, then say you come away from that part of the process with like 5 or 6 things that you're like, this is really interesting. I would be interested in exploring it more. It feels big and scary and pie in the sky, and I don't know how I could possibly make this a reality, right? Some of those things. And then the next part of the formula is experimentation. And it's actually like a pretty systematic process to say, okay, I have this big, crazy idea. The first step is let me write down every single question that I have about this thing. I know you talk about limiting beliefs on the podcast a lot. Like when it's a limiting belief that comes up, I always say, how can we turn that into a question instead? And then that's one of the questions that you have. So someone might say, one of the limiting beliefs might be like, I could never, ever make money doing that. The question is, how do people make money doing that? Or
Mm.
I don't have what's needed, for that. Like what resources and skills are actually required to move something like this forward? So some of them are going to be questions that we have. And some of the questions are going to be, do I even like this? I think that I would like this, but am I actually going to when I try it out? Right? My hypothesis is yes, but I don't
Sure.
actually know until I take action. And so you write down every question that you can think of about that. And then we get back into brainstorming. So then you brainstorm, what are all of the ways that I could answer these questions through experiments? And I think of experiments as internet research is not an experiment.
Okay.
I think of experiments as you have a conversation with a person, you go and you actually observe something happening, or you do like a beta test of your own, right? So, for example, for me, when I first went through this process, one of the like big ideas that came out for me was like, what if I ran retreats in like beautiful places around the world that I slow
Yeah.
traveled to, right? All of that stuff. And so the questions were like, would I actually like doing it? Would people show up to it? Is this something people can make money doing? Is it worth the time? Like that sort of thing. And so experiments were conversations, observations, and tests, right? So conversations were, let me talk to people who've run retreats before and see what their experience is. What's the pitfalls? What worked really well? What didn't? What should I know? The second thing was observations. Great. If I want to run a retreat, I should go to a Camp FI or a Sense Positive, the one that Tanya Hester used to run, right? Or Chautauqua or any of those sorts of events to like just get a sense of what that looks like, what I like from that, what I would do differently. And then the last was, how do you actually do a beta test of some sort? Right. And so instead of saying, okay, I'm going to go in and I'm just going to like immediately plan this 3-day retreat, I was like, hey, let me go and do a 1-hour workshop at my local ChooseFI group, which is
Nice.
exactly what I did. That was my like first step was go run a workshop at my local ChooseFI group. And then the pandemic happened. And so, we ended up not doing in-person stuff for a while, but that was like my first step to say, okay, I'm going to do some virtual stuff. I'm going to start the coaching, all of this stuff that got me to a place where 5 years ago, that idea felt so pie in the sky. And now I'm running retreats, and that's a part of just what I do. Yeah. So, right, you experiment. So, through conversations, observations, or beta tests. And then you reflect on it. What did I learn from this? Did I actually enjoy it? Do I want to keep going in this direction or do I want to pivot? And what way do I want to pivot? And the important thing about experimentation, one, it answers your questions, right? And so
Okay.
the focus then is less on, is this beta test or this thing that I'm trying out conventionally successful? And it's more focused on, what am I learning from this and how am I answering my questions? And then that's the thing that then will propel us forward. And then we learn a lot about ourselves and what we really want, which then is where that process starts over again. So we go sort of back into stage one, where we say, okay, based on what I learned from this experiment, does this refine what I truly know that I love to do, my core motivations and the conditions that I would need
Right.
to be able to do this in the best way? Then taking action opens our mind to new possibilities, and we start to build confidence that like, oh, these things actually are possible. And then it allows us to, as we move into stage 2 again, to dream bigger.
Interesting. Okay, I love that because yeah, as you were describing it, I was wondering how we were going to come back to stage 1 because in my mind's eye I was like, okay, we'll just go back to stage 2 where we had these 5 ideas we came up with, or if maybe we had a small group and we came up with 30, 50 ideas. At some point we picked one, right? And I do want to dive into that a little bit if you don't mind. Is going back to that stage 2 to 3 the first time. But right, so once you've gone through that, you've experimented, you've adjusted, you've learned about yourself, then you come back to stage 1, it's probably not as deep of a dive because you're not a completely different human being, right? Like the first time on stage 1, I imagine, is really exploratory. That's like an amazing amount of time and thought that goes into that. When you're coming back to stage 1, of course, there's still a lot. You've learned a lot about yourself, but you already have this background. Okay, so that enables you to refine and then go back to stage 2 again. And yeah, like you might even continue working potentially on the original thing you picked as a dream big, but it might iterate, it might be larger, it might be more focused, whatever it is, but you have all that additional information from having experimented actually live with it.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's exactly right. I think one thing that I want to call us back on is you said you choose one thing. I don't ever think you just choose one thing. I feel like you're
Ooh,
always going to
nice.
choose like a few things that you're interested in exploring further. And I think some of this goes back to just the idea, like you talk about the talent stack a lot, where like we all probably have 3 to 4 things that we're interested in exploring at any different time. And some of them we're going to spend more time on, and some of them we might spend less time on. But the idea is that we're experimenting with a whole variety of different things that teach us different things. And then we figure out how to like put those skills and ideas together in different ways over time that we probably wouldn't imagine being, at this moment, there's things that I won't be able to imagine putting together that I'll probably do 5 years from now.
Right, right, right. Okay, I love that. And I'm so glad we came back to it. So, stage 2, I think that's the only part that I'm a little uncertain on is all right, so we have this whole list. Let's say we were able to, maybe through our local ChooseFI group, we got a group together after they hear this episode. A group at the ChooseFI Richmond local group gets together, 5, 7 of us, and we help each other brainstorm, right? And we come up with a list. When it's my turn, we have 30 different things for the dream big, right? Where do I go from there? Do I clue in on like what energizes me the most? Do I look for things that are maybe like synergistic, for lack of a better, non corporate buzzword? But how do I think about that? How do you counsel people to move from stage 2 to 3?
Okay, so if you have a bunch of ideas and you're wondering, okay, which ones do I actually choose to move forward with? I think that's where you pull out your what, your why, and your how. It's like you have a compass or like a lens at which to look at your different ideas, and you can say which ones are most aligned with the things that I've articulated are most important to me.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. So, right. I think maybe it's a, as we talked about before, limiting belief. It's maybe a limiting belief that I would have had about that stage 2 is I probably wouldn't have used it as much of as a brainstorming exercise. And I would have been like looking for the 4 perfect things. So I probably would have culled the list down in my own head and limited it before it ever got to this larger list. And I guess if I'm reading between the lines properly, it's dream big, just brainstorm ideas, and then you can scrutinize it.
Yes, exactly. Like when we're brainstorming ideas, the whole idea behind it is that we don't want to censor any of those ideas. And you don't have to do anything on that list if you don't want to. Like I think sometimes we make lists and we assume like it's a to-do list and I have to do all of the things. No, we're just brainstorming. And one strategy that I use, and this is really a mindset piece, is I really love the Disney creative strategy. And the Disney creative strategy breaks idea generation into 3 distinct phases. So you have the dreamer phase, the realist phase and the critique phase, right? So the dreamer phase is where you're fully just brainstorming ideas. You are not shutting down any possible idea. And you also know there's time later to figure out how to make this work and what could possibly go wrong, right? All we're doing in this stage is dreaming, right? And so it's like, if we can create a container for that and catch ourselves when we're starting to shut down ideas, we can stay in that dreamer phase. Sometimes I also like to think of the dreamer phase using improv as a strategy. So you have this like yes and kind of approach where, somebody's going to share something. And instead of saying like, oh no, but this is why that, all of the reasons why that wouldn't work, or doing that to yourself, which is I think what we often do, is to say, how can I just like accept this thing as a gift and build on it? And so I'm going to say, yes. And what about this? And what about that? And what about that? And the whole idea is not that you have to like that first idea. It's that if you don't say no to it, that maybe someone else will say something that sparks something for someone else, that then sparks something for you, which ends up being the idea that you get really excited about that you would have never gotten to had that inner critic shown up earlier in that process to shut it down.
Okay. No, I totally get that. I love that. So, right, dreamer stage. I'm so glad that we did clarify that because, right, like stage 2 is just it really is dream big and dream wide, right? Like just don't let yourself self censor the ideas. Just come up with it and really look at them with that what, why, and how, and dive into like what feels the best here. And again, my mind would have said I have to pick one. I have to pick the perfect one, but clearly you're not saying that. It's pick a couple and experiment and adjust. This is about learning more about yourself. Jessica, that's how I'm seeing this, right? So, like, when you ask the question, like, what is the cure for the boring middle? Because frankly, the boring middle could be 5, 10, 12 plus years, right? Very easily on a path to 5, maybe more. If you think of this game as just financial, then yeah, those do look like boring middle years. If you look at this as, okay, I've set my financial life on a trajectory that is just going to work essentially on autopilot. And now I get to spend all of these years doing this 3-stage iterative process to learn more about myself and what I want my life to look like. Well, then it changes the whole game. That's how I see this.
Exactly.
Jessica, thank you so very much for being here. This is really going to make a difference in a lot of people's lives because it works. It makes sense. Like as I'm going through this, like this is intuitive to me, but frankly, I would have never gotten there myself. I just wouldn't have. And I think about this stuff all the time. So this to me is a cure for, hey, what do these years look like? Well, these aren't the wasted, boring years. These are the most important years. So now you, the listener, you have a way to work through this. You have a way to think about this. You have a framework. And Jessica, you rock. Thank you so much for being here. How can people find you? How can they get in touch? I know obviously you mentioned blog and YouTube, which I think is a new endeavor, and obviously in-person events as well, which I'm sure are absolutely amazing. Where can people reach out?
Yeah. So people can find us and our content on our blog, which is thefineears.com, and our YouTube channel, which is YouTube at Fioneers. And then we also have a variety of programs and events if people are interested in going deeper. And so we have, say, this is January. So we have our SlowFi retreat, which is happening and focusing on all of this lifestyle design stuff. That'll be happening in October of 2024. And there are still tickets at the time of this recording. So if anyone's interested in that, but that is a thing that we do on an annual basis. And then I also work with a small number of people each year to go deeper in small group coaching programs to walk through this lifestyle design process. And so if that's of interest to people, you can find information about that on my website.
Amazing. That sounds wonderful. And I love how you mentioned slow-fi. So you and your husband, Corey, coined that phrase, slow-fi. And I think you popularized ChooseFI. I actually thought you invented it, but I think you were the ones who really brought that to the forefront. So, I mean, two of the most important phrases in the entire FI world came from the Fineears, which is just a cool little footnote in FI history.
Awesome.
Awesome, Jessica. Well, thank you again for being here. And until next time.
Thank you.